What followed during the next 100 years came to be called Jim Crow. It was a body of state and local laws, policies, behaviors mandating the racial segregation of schools, public accommodations, transportation, the segregation of restrooms, restaurants, and drinking fountains for whites and blacks, mostly in the South, but sometimes in other parts of the country as well. The U.S. military was also segregated. Former Arizona legislative leader Art Hamilton.
The thing I would say about post-Civil War, certainly through the 1950s, 60s, is that the country claimed having fought the Civil War, the North having won the Civil War, passed and amended the Constitution to reflect that all folk were created equal. We systematically sat back and allowed that not to be the case. One part of the country went back to pre-Civil War without the legal structure. The other parts of the country turned its back and ignored it, having fought the war and being able to claim that we had now, quote, won the peace. We continued for more than 100 years, more than 100 years, to believe that we had the capacity, so long as the papers, the structure, the Constitution, the language read appropriately, that we had done enough, that there was no need to make one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, a living, breathing document for all folks. The most poignant thing I think ever said about that was said in my judgment by Dr. King in his great speech, and it wasn't the line about I have a dream. He said, we have sent a check to Washington demanding that our rights be recognized in total and in full, and that the government of the United States has returned that check to us marked insufficient funds. My father, God rest his soul, fought in World War II. He was a decorated Army veteran. He received 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. And yet, when he was mustered out of the service at Luke Air Force Base and would drive between Luke and Williams Air Force Base, he could not stop at the restaurants along Grand Avenue and get a sandwich. He had to go to the back, and they'd hand him sandwiches in a brown bag to eat in the car on the way there. When he would look through the window of that restaurant as he got back in his vehicle, he would see former German POWs who had fought on the other side of World War II, sitting in those restaurants having lunch or dinner. Of all the things in his life that haunted my dad, and I think that haunted a lot of people, is that whenever the country called, they answered the call and tried to be equal to the responsibilities of full citizenship. And in times of peril, were almost treated as if they were full and equal citizens, only to come home after those contests and find that they had to be once again relegated to whatever position people either would give them or would allow them to hold. It seems to me, in many ways, the period from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to the beginning, really, of the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and 60s was a more painful period than even pre-Civil War, because the absolute hypocrisy of not living up to the mandates of the Constitution were really manifest for all to see. We had fought a war, we had won the war theoretically, and yet still people were willing to allow some of its citizens, based on race or color or creed or language, to be treated differently. Even allowing some of its citizens to be interred in camps during World War II, even though they happened to be good, loyal American citizens, but they happen to be Japanese by birth. And yet there really wasn't a great call to put into concentration or put into camps to keep an eye on German Americans, Italian Americans. It is a painful period for a lot of people. And that pain, I think, even today still remains for a lot of folks.
Well, as noted earlier, Arizona became a U.S. territory in 1863, but it would be 49 years before achieving statehood, the last of the contiguous 48 states. It is true that after the Civil War, a good number of the people arriving to settle in Arizona Territory were former Confederate soldiers and sympathizers. Now, this doesn't mean that the territory just became an extension of the Old South. I imagine there were plenty of Dixie attitudes, but relations between whites and African Americans did not make many headlines, and the reason was simple. There were hardly any black people here. The U.S. Census of 1870 recorded the Negro population as only 26 souls. By 1880, it was still only 155. Even today, African American populations in Arizona is proportionately smaller than many other states. Our past documentary titled Almost Free, A History of the Black Experience in Arizona, covers this story in depth. Those African Americans who did come west had at least one thing in common with the white Southern newcomers. They were looking for a new start. One black Arizona cowboy later wrote a memoir titled, quote, The Autobiography of Nat Love, published in 1907. He noted that he had left South Carolina because, quote, smart Negroes were not much in demand there, end quote. The larger racial or ethnic minority in the territory was the Mexican American population, which in the past had been the majority. In the early couple of decades of the territory, Hispanics held many seats in the legislature and were elected as the mayors of Tucson and Yuma. But such political successes pretty much came to an end as large numbers of Anglos began to move in. Still, there did continue to be many successful and prominent Mexican-American families. Dr. Christine Marin.
In the Arizona Territory, there were many Hispanics or Mexicans who were quite prominent in the sense that they were merchants, they were freighters, they were those who were able to carry a little bit of political knowledge and power among others. But they were quite astute and quite entrepreneurial because they were able to bridge that gap between providing services not only to the military, but also providing economic services to the territory. There was the Samaniego family, the Tully family, the Ochoa family, and many others who were now providing services to mines, for example, away from Tucson. And now with the area that we now call Phoenix also beginning to stir up some kind of development, there was talk of bringing in some of that business up to the central region of Salt River Valley. So we did have some of these families who were in the territory, who were representing some kind of a new political strength among Mexicans or Hispanics who were able to probably explain some of their concerns about this new idea of territorialism and also what was going to happen in the territory.
But as with other parts of the country, Jim Crow reared its head, notably in the workplace.
So in order to bring in laborers, immigrants were still coming from the east to the west to work in the copper mines. There were Serbian groups, Italian groups, the groups from England and Italy, but the dominant group was the Mexican group. And this was the group that was the most exploited in terms of their labor. There soon began to be a division of labor and what was going to be called a dual division of pay. Mexican pay and Anglo pay, Mexican work and Anglo work. There would be that difference in pay, but for the same number of hours. And the hours would also become a source of contention for workers who were also going to be working longer hours but receiving less pay than their Anglo counterparts. So what we have is a combination of labor unrest, the idea of forming unions to represent workers, the idea of unions coming to represent Anglo workers only, but not Mexican workers, and then of course the dual division of labor and pay. That began in the early 1900s. It would continue in 1903, 1907, and even up to statehood.
And there were problems in other areas.
Mexican workers and Mexican families in those towns would also be subject to divisions. They would live in separate housing areas. They would be treated differently because of their religion. They were Catholics, not Protestants. They ate different food. They ate Mexican food that may not have been considered American in a sense. Perhaps they were viewed differently because they didn't speak English. They were treated differently also because they might have been thought of as working for cheap wages. So there was that competitiveness for money and for wages that would occur in the mining regions. And this was all going to take place in the mining towns.
And just to put a big exclamation point on the topic of housing discrimination, we're going to show you a video clip from a documentary I produced about 20 years ago. It's about the wording in the legal title to a Phoenix house built in the 1920s, a house I owned at the time of that broadcast. This 1925 deed to a Phoenix home sums it up. Quote, "No part of said premises shall ever be conveyed or transferred to any person or persons of African, Japanese, Chinese, or Mexican descent." End quote. Such racial restrictions are, of course, no longer legal.